Alright, so now I wanted to do something that we surprisingly haven't done yet, which is talk about the Tron movies. And even though we're, putting this under the Versus thing and calling it that, I don't think I want to do the back and forth, comparing them an aspect at a time thing. Not just because it's a movie and its sequel, but it's a movie and its 28 years later sequel. So I figure we'll just talk about one and then the other and talk about the strengths and all that. Um, and we'll just go from there. So, to talk about the first movie, um, there's I was trying to figure out how to approach this because the first movie has always been one of the biggest movie-related mysteries to me, like, I've ever come across, where it's how does it still work as well as it does now, like in 2023? Because when you look at the original movie, for better or worse, it still feels like there's not really another movie that looks like it. And the reason for that is it does feel very much in this 80s sort of computer-generated world. So, the question that I always have, that I still have not quite figured out, is does it look laughably dated, or does it look incredible? Because it feels like both, but I honestly land more on the incredible side. And I feel like it's one of those cases where either you go with it or you don't. Because I could see somebody who's like, a younger person who's maybe grown up with effects being, super state-of-the-art, and looking like they do in Tron Legacy, um, and thinking that this has not a lot of merit to it, and it looks super old and all that. But I don't know, I still watch the original movie, and I feel more invested in it than I do most, modern day green screen movies. And like I said, I don't really know how it pulls that off, but I think a lot of it has to do with, because I'm not even, like, a gamer in any way whatsoever, except in, like, the very slightest sense. But I imagine it works, both of these work, as, like, this sort of ultimate fantasy for a gamer to, like, be inside the game and sort of playing, like, up close and personal, and having, like, clear objectives and different kinds of games and all that. It takes me back to, I don't know if anybody remembers the show, Nick Arcade, where when you got to the final round, they did the thing where, like, the kids were behind the door and then, like, in front of the green screen, and they were just, reaching for props or whatever. But on the screen, like on TV, it looked like they were inside the game. And that was one of those things that, as a kid, as a very small kid, I just could not wrap my head around, like, how they ended up in the game and what that must be like. And in the idea that it could be somebody actually going inside a game, this movie is really, like, kind of shows us probably what that would feel like. Not just from the characters' perspectives, but from us as an audience. It sort of gives us that vibe that we're inside something, and that it's surrounded by the characters are surrounded by characters that we can invest in also, because it kind of has the camaraderie that kind of comes with playing a game with somebody, playing on the same team as somebody. And so when we meet these characters, even though they're, just programs inside a computer or whatever, even though in the movie's case they appear to be like live action actors still, in the context, they're just, like other programs. So you would think the stakes would feel kind of low and like they're not even really there. But like I said, I think it's the idea that comes from, like, camaraderie in gaming gives you that idea of when you see, Flynn go through these games and these objectives with these other characters, you get the sense that there's this sort of attachment, and that it actually feels genuinely tragic when one of them dies. So looking at that, you would think that's where the full strengths of the movie are. Like, because we have live action stuff, and then we have stuff inside the computer world, that it would make the live action scenes seem a bit lackluster by comparison. But I've never really thought that way. I feel like I like I mean, obviously it's completely different. But I've always really liked the live action scenes also. I think a lot of that has to do with the charisma of Bridges. It is interesting to see Jeff Bridges leading a movie like this. Like, not to, take away from what Tron is, but the fact that Jeff Bridges already had 2 Oscar nominations by the time by the time he made this movie. And so to see him here, it does feel like it has like the classic feel of the live action Disney movies of the 70s and 80s, particularly the ones that starred Kurt Russell. Like I can imagine this movie starring Kurt Russell if it had been just merely maybe a few years prior than when it actually came out. And like I said, even though a lot of it's set in that computer world and the computer generated world, it still very much has the feel of those classic Disney movies of that particular era that were usually completely live action or mostly live action. And how they'd still brought that touch to this brand new thing they were doing and setting up this new technology in this new world. And also having an actor like David Warner playing the villain in the real world. And it's, like I said, the way they're able to bring those actorly traits, I guess you could say, to a story like this, where it adds this sort of almost grounded nature to the outside world, which actually brings the stakes into the computer-generated world. And they're really working together here. And like I said, one doesn't really feel lackluster compared to the other. It feels like they're working together. And we still have some great imagery in the real world. I love when we see David Warner's helicopter like just going through the night with like the red lights and stuff like that. And there are these vibes. The closing scene, like the very final shot of the movie, also plays into this idea of giving you vibes of what will be or what was the computer generated world with some of the overhead shots we see of real life in the real world. And as the combination of those two, I love it. Like, it doesn't feel like there's a boring stretch, whether we're in the real world or the computer world, which I love. And I also love the idea of it just sort of, once it takes us inside, how it just sort of, it actually logically sort of combines the idea of the world working through, like everything is like programming and everything is, like all the other characters are programs and stuff like that. But it also feels like you're inside a video game also. Like, where it could just be one or the other. They're inside a computer or they're inside a game, but the way it uses, the logic of the way the world works sort of uses both aspects of it being inside a computer and being a game in itself. And just how the world operates on that is something that I really love. Another thing where I feel like, regardless of how you feel of how it looks effects-wise, it just really brings it to life in this really great way. And as far as talking about the other characters and how they behave and stuff like that, this idea of having this almost religion around the idea of the users, and it's like, do you believe in users or do you not? And we have, like, when we're introduced to Crom, I think his name is, the character that comes in and says, like, oh, my users, this part of me, like a full branch manager, and he'll be super angry about this, and the guard says, oh, great, another religious nut. And it's like, the way they do that, and the way they break up the believers and put the believers into the games, that could be seen as like this really. Here's the reason why I like it, is the fact that, yeah, it could be seen as this whole thing about religious persecution or something, but I don't. The fact that I feel like the movie's not trying to be about that, I kind of just feel like it's a fun detail to kind of bring in something we might recognize from the real world and put it into this one, where we're talking about how the world operates in this sort of hodgepodge kind of way that works really well. And I don't think, like, you would think it's maybe being a little heavy-handed, but I don't think it's trying enough to be that thing that it comes off heavy-handed. Like I said, it just feels like this sort of fun detail that brings, like, real-world, thoughts and the way people behave into this computer world, which I really love. So I don't think it's trying to be, more than what it is, which is a huge asset to it. Another thing is, we just talked about margin call in, like, the last video, and I was talking about how with the dialogue and what they're talking about, how more often than not, probably a general audience isn't really going to completely understand the dialogue, or maybe even be able to keep up with it as far as, like, what's what, and what does this mean when they say it, and how does this, connect with this, or whatever. But much like we were talking about with margin call, the fact that it doesn't really have to explain everything in detail, where, number one, if they tried to explain everything in detail as far as the mechanics of it and how everything works, and what everything means, like, what the terminology they're using means, down to every definition, would really slow things down and also make the characters not be able to talk the way they typically would. That stays true to their character. But we have just enough context clues and just enough action, I feel like, to get us there. To the point that it never feels slowed down by anything. And the fact that this movie is only like an hour and a half just feels so concise and so right. That adding anything else in here just to try to explain things would really weigh it down. So just to kind of let the world explain itself as we watch it was definitely a great way to go. And it's the kind of thing, I hate this kind of thing because it's so played out, but you think about the fact of how movies like Tron don't really feel like they're much around anymore as far as all of these qualities that make it so special and make it still so great in 2023. And that's even, like, even when you look at, sound for the time also, the sound in this is really, like, those moments when they're playing, when he's playing that first game with Crom, Flynn is, and just the sounds that their steps make are, like, really satisfying in a way that's kind of hard to describe. Or the sounds during the light cycle games and stuff like that. And, like, that combined with, we were talking about the imagery, but, like, not only is it, putting us in the aesthetic of, like, an 80s computer game or video game, but when we get those moments like the first-person view, like in the maze and stuff like that, manages to make this world really immersive, despite how it may look like, 80s CGI or whatever. But I think that's kind of the key to the aesthetic also, is the fact that, even though it does look like it might be dated effects or whatever, they are inside an 80s computer and an 80s sort of game, so the idea that it has those graphics, I feel like, is something else that feels like it's able to stick with, it's able to still have the impact in 2023, because we still know what games looked like at that time and what graphics looked like at that time. And so to see, like, the characters inside that still has its own appeal, where, like, at the time it might have just been this sort of, it might have had a bit more of a modern feel, but now it kind of has this appealing retro kind of feel, and that's why I feel like the effects probably work so well still. And when you see everything in the world, like, around every corner in this whole hour and a half, it seems like we're always kind of seeing something new around the corner. Like, there's some kind of different creation. Like, we've got, like, the recognizers flying around, which are now kind of like this iconic image that everybody recognizes. There's the bit, that seems like a character that wouldn't be as memorable as it actually is. Because it just kind of seems like a blob of sorts, but when you see, like, the different details of it and how, like, the colors change based on how it answers and stuff like that, and the little voice and all of that, that's something that could have just been this throwaway detail that's actually memorable, amongst all the other things here, like all the different landscapes, the modes of transportation, the games themselves. It's a movie of boundless creativity throughout it. And I love the fact that it never really feels that dated. It's like, even if it does start to feel dated, like I said, I like to refer to it more as feeling retro rather than dated. Because dated implies that it doesn't work anymore. Retro can imply that, yeah, it may look old, and it's very apparent and conscious to you that it's old, but it still very much works, and maybe it being old is actually playing a part in how well it still works, and plays into the appeal of it. And so, that's pretty much all I can really say about it. I kind of love it's interesting how you can say there's a simplicity to the movie despite how elaborate all those things feel, where it's like it has all those different details and all those different ways it sort of expands on its creativity and its ideas as it goes on. And we introduce, like, new aspects to what's inside the computer and inside the game and stuff like that. And, yeah, it's just still so fun even now. And it's especially interesting that it still feels that way, because you would think, now that we took the CGI we could use in 2010 and created a whole world that seems so significantly more vast and so, like, kind of feels closer to a real world or a real life, just in, like, an alternate universe or something, is what Legacy feels like. And the fact that we can have the effects that we have in Legacy and how that doesn't really play against what the original movie looks like. It just shows the evolution that technology has gone through. And whether we're going backward or forward, it still has the same appeal, just with a totally different look and maybe a totally different feel. Because when you look at Tron Legacy, I actually didn't like Tron Legacy when it first came out, and I feel like a number of factors probably played into that. Where it was probably burnout on movies trying to be as big and CGI heavy as possible. There was the fact that it was released in 3D, which in retrospect you might think, oh, this movie in 3D must be, that's the kind of stuff that 3D's made for, that must have been amazing. It kind of wasn't. It felt a bit almost, because 3D was also something that was like way played out by that point, and it was basically just used as a gimmick to jack up ticket prices rather than have any sort of effect on the movie itself. And the fact that it just made everything look darker, with 3D glasses like having that sort of dimming effect. So watching this now, and on like 2D on a Blu-ray looks incredible, and that's when I watch this movie now is the experience I wished I had had when it was in theaters, believe it or not. But going into it, obviously the thing that stands out to them, even the people that don't like it will say, you know, it's worth this movie existing just for the Daft Punk soundtrack. And while that's true, like I said, I've gotten much more of an appreciation for the movie as time has gone on, and like I said, without the context of 3D being played out in 2010 and, you know, big CGI movies being played out in 2010. It's also worth noting that we have a recognizable director now with Joseph Kosinski, who we didn't really know at the time, but who has now since gone on to do everything from, you know, Oblivion to Top Gun Maverick, Only the Brave, which I'll, you know, recommend anytime, any chance I get. And yeah, you can see the makings of the great director he would be by the time he'd get to, like, Maverick. In something like this, where you can see this, you know, like we were talking about, just this massive, massive world, on top of the idea of doing something many years after its previous movie, and being able to take the aspects of it that worked and just continue to expand upon it, and also tell a bit more of a human story. It's kind of wild where you can see the similarities between the transition from Top Gun to Top Gun Maverick to Tron Legacy. And Kosinski is kind of the continuing factor here. But we're also dealing with de-aging in a way that we aren't really now. And while there's some de-aging in recent movies that looks pretty incredible, there's also a lot of de-aging that doesn't. And this was an early case of it, where I remember, when you want to talk about how early we were in the de-aging stuff, like when we were, you know, pre-Marvel really getting into it, and then everything that came after that, I remember not thinking that Clue looking like young Jeff Bridges. I don't remember it looking weird at the time. Like, I remember feeling like it was, oh, that's interesting that they did that. That's kind of cool that they did that. But it feels like now, in retrospect, now that we've seen what we are capable of when de-aging works really well, this looks it looks pretty crazy, and I don't know if it's in the best way, but I do think it suits the movie because Clue is the villain of the story. And so for him to, and the fact that he's a program, so for him to look, you know, not exactly like a human, like, he looks like an inhuman young Jeff Bridges, and I actually feel like that perfectly suits what's going on here as far as what he looks like. So even if the idea was that he looked like actual young Jeff Bridges, the sort of off quality to it, I feel like actually suits it. Obviously it doesn't help in the opening scene when we're supposed to buy that it's actual young Jeff Bridges. That's a little weird. But when he's Clue, I feel like it actually makes sense if his look would be off-putting. So I think that might have been a happy accident that happened, especially as time has gone on. So as far as the idea of bringing in, like, the young character, where, like we said, we saw it work in Top Gun Maverick, but it doesn't, I feel like it doesn't work very often when you do a long-delayed sequel and you're like, oh, now it's about the kid. That usually doesn't work. But bringing in Garrett Hedlund to play Sam, and the way we see Sam sort of taking over, like, story-wise, before we even get into the incredible effects and the incredible world, the great thing that both these movies do, but Legacy especially, is to make sure we get that story focus, and the story gives context to what's going on, and gives context to why Sam should be the main character of this story now. And it all works. It all makes sense also from an emotional standpoint, with the idea of Flynn getting trapped inside the world, and then him assuming that he's just disappeared, and the world assuming he's disappeared, and he's doing like eccentric genius things or something. Bringing Bruce Boxleitner back also as Alan was a really big asset, and kind of gives us that sort of core connection, because obviously he's literally Tron, like he had to be in this movie. But to give him that sort of connection with Sam, we kind of see at the beginning where he's the one that's kind of been here when Flynn hasn't, because Flynn's been stuck. And the idea that, and the part that Tron ultimately plays in this as it goes on, where it seems like they write him out in a way that's like kind of, oh, that was such a bad idea. He's literally Tron. You have to have him. But the way they were able to bring that back around and bring Tron back into the story, and make it almost like a tragic story for Tron. Actually, there's a lot of things going on here. It almost feels operatic in a sense, or like some tragedy of sorts. And it's really well done the way they were able to bring back those aspects without it just feeling like, hey, do you remember this thing? Hey, I know you liked this thing. I don't think there's anything in Legacy that really feels like that, because that's the thing they really bank on when they typically do movies like this. But the thing is like, when we see, a recognizer, yeah, we appropriately recognize it. Or when we see, the light cycles and stuff like that, all of this is stuff where it doesn't just feel like, oh, this is the thing that was cool before, because they've amplified it so much, and they've made it look so sleek, and everything feels so like we were talking about before, where it's going from an 80s game to what video games look like now, and like you can see the evolution, and this is where we are now, and it's just like the I would say, I was in the world of the movie, you could call it new and improved. From a movie standpoint, it's not, I don't feel like it's, taking, because that sounds like it's talking down to the original movie to say it's improved. Like I said, it's just amplified, it feels like, is the term I think I want to use. And so everything, and I love the way they foreshadow this, where Sam rides a bike already in the real world. And typically that'd just be like, oh, look how rebellious he is, or something like that. And I mean, while he is rebellious, I love the fact that it perfectly plays into what happens that Sam rides a bike, because it's like when it comes to the light, because you can even see that before we even get to the light cycle portion, where it's just like, oh, I know what he's going to be good at. This is going to be awesome. And then when it gets to that point, it's satisfying, because we know this is already kind of how he lives his life and how he gets around anyway. So he's already going to excel at light cycle. And stuff like that's just really fun. And like I said, the way they integrate it into the characters before they even come into this world is it makes everything much stronger when we get to what the big sort of show point of the movie is, the big action and the stuff that we kind of came here to see. And like I said, see it in this new sort of super sleek way. And I think another thing that helps also is that it doesn't feel like, if this were a movie where the effects were half-assed, which is what we see a lot now, this would not have worked at all. But the fact that the effects in this movie are basically flawless is gonna I love that they put significance on that, and you could tell they put significance on that, where it's like, if the effects in this don't look fucking incredible, this movie is not gonna work. If anything, people will laugh this movie out of theaters if it doesn't look incredible and sleek and flawless. And you can see where the budget went. Like, when you have these movies that have like the half-assed CGI and stuff like that, and just movies in general now, where the budgets are so overinflated, and it's like, how did you spend that much money on this piece of shit? Is what you'll say a lot in theaters now with these big budget movies. But when you look at this, 170 million seems to be the budget I saw when I looked it up. And 170 million almost seems low given what we're looking at, where it's a complete transportation to another insanely bigger place. And it's like, the fact that you can see every single place the budget went, and where like nobody was half-assing this movie. Even from a writing standpoint, they could have, and at times maybe they did. Like, there's times where both movies do this, where they might kind of, find a workaround, or maybe not explain something that might not completely make sense, but it makes enough sense as far as like, what the objectives are, what the plot is, where the character motivations, stuff like that, to where it just doesn't really, it seems like it's pulling back to be pedantic about certain things about it. Because it's still telling the story that it needs to tell and hitting the beats that it needs to hit, whether it be emotional beats or just making this world look incredible and exciting and exhilarating, really. Because these action scenes, when we see like the disc wars and stuff like that, when we see like the characters shatter, and it's like everything looks so amazing. Like nothing like you would expect, like maybe like when they shatter or something, there'd be moments where it's like, oh, that doesn't look great, but everything else looks great. Like even Terminator 2 has, a moment here or there that's like, oh, that was a tiny bit shoddy, but everything, it doesn't matter because everything else is so incredible. You won't really find much of a shoddy moment in this. And like I said, anything that looks like it could be just kind of feels like it fits in the world and is supposed to be there. Um, and then, like I said, the way we've made, Light Cycle bigger and better than before. There's the upside down duel that's happening. Like they're like we were talking about with the boundless creativity in the original movie. They're doing the same thing here, only on a much grander scale. It feels like, and that never lets up. And it's the thing also where I feel like I remember getting a bit tired out by the action in the theater when I saw it also. But like I said, when you see everything, how everything really does have a purpose as far as action scenes go, it never feels like an action scene breaks out for no reason, which is great. Like the fight scene in Michael Sheen's club is really well done, and it might seem like maybe it feels out of place in a Tron movie, but not really when we know what's going on there story wise. And then of course when we get to the end, naturally we're gonna have a big sort of shooting climax and stuff like that, and the light jets. But I don't know. Everything still feels like it works, and even if it does feel like it goes on maybe a tad long, not really by much. Like not enough to fault the movie or the climax itself. Because like I said, because a lot of this one especially is emotion driven, whether it be the Tron arc and how Clue sort of corrupted him, and then the way he finds himself again. And the sacrifices that are made when Flynn makes his whole big thing. Like, everything feels emotion-based as far as what all happens in this climax. And talking about that also, another character that you would think would be sort of just written in for the sake of it, that has much more going on, is the Olivia Wilde character. Because, of course, I remember the trailers and all the posters and the spots where it's like we see her in, like, the suit and she's, like, laying on the couch and stuff like that, and it's like, oh, they hired Olivia Wilde for eye candy. Okay. But no, this character is like kind of the heart of the movie, actually. Where she's the one where it's, I mean, obviously she also has comedic moments throughout where she's, just learning about the outside world, and she has the moment with, do you know Jules Verne, that whole thing. But then we have these moments where we realize that as she's, a program that's trying to learn more about basically everything, we kind of see that that Flynn still had a child of sorts, even if it wasn't Sam. So he was still raising somebody in that kind of way. And so I like the way that plays off of her interactions with Sam, where they talk about, how when he has to describe the son to her and stuff like that. And these moments that are like actually genuinely beautiful and character-driven moments also. And so what I like about that is it could have been this really lame setup of there's some romantic connection between the two of them, which for starters would be kind of weird because he's human and she's a program. But the fact that she was basically, made by and raised by Flynn, which is what should have been his life, but then there's this understanding between the three of them and with this reunion, and when he understands where Flynn has been and why things happened the way they did, by the time we get to the last scene where Olivia Wilde comes out into the real world with Sam, I get more like brother and sister vibes, could be, because like I said, where they both kind of come from Flynn and they've both learned from him in this way, and where she may have been more sort of like fathered by him. There's still this connection here, like this a sort of familial connection rather than anything that might resemble romantic or something like that, which is the path that movies typically go down. So when you see Garrett Hill and Olivia Wilde in this movie and they interact, you might think you might just instinctively think that's the direction they want to take it. But there's an innocence about her that, like I said, makes it feel more like it's like a sibling kind of thing, and how they both come from Flynn. So that's the way I've always taken that. And not just her, there's quite a few memorable side characters here, and that's the kind of thing also that it really just brings any movie to life. Where it's like if you just have a few memorable side characters, and just let them do their own thing. That's something else that can just really sort of keep the life in a movie. And so when we mentioned Michael Sheen, obviously, who is whenever you throw Michael Sheen into a big budget movie, it's basically the most glorious thing ever. Like, he knows exactly what his job is, and he will give you 150%. And I love the idea of, it's like, oh, we're gonna put you in a Tron movie, and you're a club owner, and so it feels like what they said was, you can do anything you want now. Like, what do you want to do? And research tells me he said he came up with the character with three different traits. It was, there's a lot of Bowie, which you can absolutely tell. There was the MC in Cabaret, specifically Joel Grey's performance in Cabaret. That you can see a lot. And apparently he threw in just a little smidge of Frankenfurter from Rocky Horror. And it's like, that's why you hire Michael Sheen, especially for parts like this. Yeah, he can play real-world figures, he can play serious, he can play downplayed, but when you ask him to do something like this, he's going to go all out, and the movie's going to be better for it. If anything, I actually remember, I think one of the criticisms I had in 2010 was the movie never really comes down from... Like, the movie feels not as, I guess, eventful or as big and inspired once he blows up. And it's like the movie feels a bit lesser and not as energetic when we lose that character, was one of my criticisms in 2010. And so I do love the way he was used in small doses and the way he just kind of comes and goes and leaves his own impact. Same thing for James Frain here as Jarvis, who is Clue's, like, henchman. And once again, he doesn't really do... He's basically the Ebony Maw, where he doesn't have to do much, but he's just sinister enough in the way he sort of slinks around and speaks, that he's this interesting character that you always keep your eye on. And I love his final moments, where he's like this big hype man for Clue, but then as soon as he's confronted with Sam after seeing what Sam can do, he just immediately buckles to him, and then lets him go. And then there's that moment where he gets cut off, where when Clue realizes what's happened and the fact that he buckled to Sam, he turns around, and very true to this character, there was just a side character, it feels like we barely knew. It makes perfect sense that this character would try to kiss ass one more time as he's dying, where he tries to say, like, death to users or something like that, just as Clue is killing him. So that character always stood out to me also. Like I said, can really just bring, to life certain aspects of the movie, and to the point where there's just no lulls in it. Like, everywhere where there's either going to be a big action scene, or a really cool effect, or, a touching character moment, and anything in between is just going to be these side characters just doing whatever the hell they want, and it's fantastic. I also like the idea of Clue because of, you would think if the movie's going to look a lot bigger, the threat has to be a lot bigger. So we were talking about how big the climax is and how it feels like it goes for quite some time. The threat in this one is significantly scarier as to what Clue wants to do, and the idea of coming out into the real world and doing God knows what, and the idea of just sort of taking over. Yeah, it's, the plot we hear about all the time with, like, AI and stuff like that, but seeing it, like, actually play out, and seeing Clue and his army and the way he riles them up, it's like, this shit's about to get really bad. Like, when we see Flynn and Sam, like, run up and see this whole speech happening, when you see the looks on their faces, it's not just like, oh, this is the part of the movie where things are getting, oh no, what's going to happen? No, you see the looks on their faces, and it's like, this is really bad. This cannot happen. And I love seeing, like, the stakes actually here, and just how big and dire and dangerous they are, and, like, how you can't even really fathom what would be the fallout from them if this plan comes to fruition. And so that's really fun, and once again adds another layer to the action as it goes on. So I think that's about what I wanted to say here. And I also like the idea of something else that it puts emphasis on, but it doesn't feel like it's doing too much, like it's not beating you with it, is appreciating the beauty of the outside world, because we do get so swept up in this world and how, like beautiful and grand it is, and like a world we'd never see. Through the Olivia Wilde character, we can build up like how, the sun and stuff like that, the stuff that we kind of take for granted. And so to have this moment that's just quietly beautiful, where they just come out and they're on the bike and she's seeing the real world for the first time and a sun for the first time, is just this moment that really drives in, like, oh, the world's actually kind of a beautiful place, believe it or not. And sometimes we might forget that. You could say maybe there's some message in there about getting too swept up in video games, but once again, much like the religious angle in the first movie, I don't think it's really trying desperately to beat us over the head with anything. It's just saying some things. Like, it's just saying, oh, isn't the world a beautiful place? That's the takeaway I get from it. And just to make sure to not take that for granted. So that's a really beautiful message in itself. So yeah. Now, as far as me preferring one over the other, like I said, it's just kind of really hard to do, because sometimes you feel like going retro, sometimes you feel like being more modern and sleek, and it just depends on the mood. That's probably anticlimactic, but like I said, as far as putting the two together as one, they both work in their different ways, and the ways for their era, but like I said, the way the original feels like when you look at it in comparison with Legacy, surprisingly for me, it doesn't make it look any worse. It just looks like a different thing that shows a different time and what it looked like then. But it's as creative and as, expansive in the context of its world, that both feel satisfying in their ways. So, once again, that's another way where I wasn't really approaching this from the versus angle also. It's just, they're both great in their ways, and I think that's where I want to leave it. So, we are going to do one more versus right after this, and then I think it'll be Owen's video, which he does annually, and then more stuff. Like one more sort of retrospective kind of thing, and then more verses and stuff like that. And then the awards predictions, another review as far as like new releases, and then it'll be October, and we'll have all that fun stuff. So until all that, I think that's it.